The German sergeant never heard the radio call. He only knew the patrol had pulled back. Standard procedure, amateurs flinching after contact. He had killed 3 of them in the first burst. His MG-42 was still warm. He settled deeper into his position in the ancient Norman hedgerow and waited for the next wave, the way he had waited 100 times before in Poland, in France, in Russia. He waited for 40 seconds. Then the sky tore open. What descended on his position was not a counterattack. It was not a flanking maneuver. It was the combined fire of an American artillery battalion, called in by a single radio operator who had crawled 20 yards back behind the hedgerow and calmly read a grid reference into his handset. 14 guns firing simultaneously, on one German machine gun nest. 1 sergeant, 1 weapon. He died without understanding what had killed him. The 2 dazed survivors who crawled out of the smoking crater were evacuated, interrogated, and eventually transferred to a prisoner of war camp somewhere in liberated France. There, in the relative calm of a canvas tent, a German major, a Stalingrad veteran, a man who had survived things that should have killed him, studied his American captors with the quiet, systematic attention of a professional soldier trying to solve a problem he cannot name. The guards were not guarding. They were leaning against rifle stocks, chewing gum, passing a cigarette from a full pack. Not a rationed pack, a full one. The major stared at it for a long moment. He had not seen a full pack of cigarettes since 1942. He was a man who had built his identity on iron discipline, on the certainty that professional mastery and force of will were the supreme currencies of war. And yet these casually dressed men with their bottomless coffee and their slouching posture were winning. Not just winning, they were dismantling everything he had been trained to believe. His bewilderment was captured in an Allied intelligence report filed in the autumn of 1944, and it was not unique. Across thousands of German letters, intercepted diaries, and battlefield interrogation transcripts, the same note sounds again and again. The Americans had produced a profound disorientation in the professional German military mind, not through tactical genius alone, not through individual courage, though that courage was real and documented, but through something the Wehrmacht had no doctrine to understand, no language to name, and no framework to counter. The Americans had not sent an army to Europe, they had sent a civilization. To understand what that meant to the German soldier who faced it, you first have to understand what the German soldier believed about himself. By 1944, the Wehrmacht was the living heir to 2 centuries of Prussian martial tradition. Its officers studied Clausewitz and Moltke not as historical figures, but as living authorities. They had internalized a philosophy of war that treated battlefield victory not as a matter of numbers or resources, but as the expression of superior will, intellect, and national character. War, in the German professional understanding, was an art form, and they were its undisputed masters. There is a single image that captures what this meant in practice. It is the image of a German sergeant, not an officer, a sergeant, lying in a shallow ditch somewhere in Belgium in the winter of 1940, watching a French column 4 times his size moving down the road below him, and making a decision, entirely on his own authority, to attack it. Not because he was ordered to, because his training had made that decision instinctive. The German system, what they called Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, produced not soldiers who followed orders, but soldiers who could be trusted to make the right decision before the order could arrive. It had crushed France in 6 weeks. It had seemed, for a time, unstoppable. The Germans did not expect the Americans to have anything like it. German military and political leadership had spent years constructing an image of America that served their ideological needs. Nazi propaganda painted the United States as a decadent, materialistic society with no warrior tradition. Its army, assembled in haste after Pearl Harbor, was seen as a structural imitation of a real fighting force, impressive on paper, hollow at its core. A formal Wehrmacht study published in 1942 concluded that the American soldier was not a fighter by nature, and that the army behind him was a colossus with no soul. The prediction was unambiguous. American troops would be road-bound, tactically naive, prone to panic under pressure. Give them one well-executed German counterattack, and they would break. Senior Wehrmacht officers genuinely believed this, not as propaganda, as professional judgment. They were wrong, and the way in which they were wrong would rewrite everything they thought they knew about war. The hedgerow country of Normandy, the Bocage, was a landscape almost designed for the German defenders' preferred style of fighting. The ancient earthen banks, overgrown with roots and thorns, created interlocking natural fortresses. A machine gun crew, dug into a hedgerow, could hold against forces many times their size, and the terrain neutralized numbers and armor while rewarding exactly the small unit tactical mastery the Germans had spent decades perfecting. Picture that German MG-42 crew, veterans of the Eastern Front, positioned behind one of these ancient banks in the summer of 1944. The gun is sighted down a narrow lane. An American patrol appears. They walk straight into the kill zone. The gun opens up. The patrol is pinned. Formation shattered in the first burst. For the crew, this is a familiar moment, almost comfortable. They wait for the American response, the desperate flanking attempt, the assault through the fire, the kind of aggressive infantry action that distinguishes soldiers from civilians. What happens instead is nothing. The American survivors crawl backward. The patrol withdraws. The firing stops. An unnatural silence settles over the Bocage, broken only by the buzz of insects in the summer heat. The German sergeant is baffled. It looks to his trained eye like a mistake born of fear and inexperience. He has 40 seconds left to live. The sound begins as a whisper, almost inaudible. Then it multiplies. Then it becomes a shriek that tears the sky. What descends on the German position is not a counter-tactic. It is an artillery barrage so overwhelming, so disproportionate to the threat of a single machine gun crew that the hedgerow itself ceases to exist. Trees that have stood for a century are vaporized. The ancient bank, the perfect defensive position, becomes a smoking crater in the Norman countryside. It wasn't outfought, it was erased. In German after-action reports from the Bocage, this pattern appears again and again, recorded with a tone that begins in contempt and gradually shifts towards something far more complex. The American infantry, the reports note, consistently refuses to close with the enemy, but every time it retreats, the same consequence follows. The artillery arrives, the fighter-bombers arrive, the position is destroyed. A company-level engagement becomes an industrial transaction. The American infantryman is not aggressive. One divisional report from Normandy stated flatly, "He is afraid to close with the enemy. He relies on his machines." The contempt in that assessment is almost audible across the decades. But contempt is a luxury you can only afford when you're winning. The P-47 Thunderbolts came without warning. German soldiers called them Jabos, Jagdbomber, fighter bombers, and the word entered their vocabulary with the weight of a curse. They appeared from nowhere, circled once with an almost casual precision, and then dove. Their wing-mounted machine guns tore up the ground, and their 500-pound bombs did not destroy positions so much as rearrange the landscape around them. A well-placed German strongpoint, a reinforced house, a crossroads defended by a veteran squad, would be there one moment and simply gone the next. Not captured, not overrun, deleted. German soldiers began to move at night, scatter their equipment, conceal vehicles not against ground observers, but against the sky. The sky itself had become the enemy's primary weapon, and the Luftwaffe that had once given Germany air supremacy over Europe was no longer there to contest it. What looked to German observers like American passivity was something else entirely. It was patience, backed by absolute confidence in the system behind every individual soldier. The American infantryman was not afraid to close with the enemy. He simply saw no rational reason to risk his life in a knife fight when a telephone call could deliver a sledgehammer. And the apparatus, with a consistency the Germans found both infuriating and deeply unsettling, never failed him. German officers began writing a phrase in their reports with increasing frequency as 1944 progressed. They were not fighting an army. They were fighting a factory. They meant it as analysis. It was also, though they did not yet fully realize it, the first articulation of their own despair. The tank encounters made it inescapable. A German panzer crew, veterans of years of armored warfare, knew the Sherman's weaknesses intimately. They had studied them. They could destroy one from distances the Americans couldn't match. The kill was clean. The Sherman burned. A gap opened in the American advance. By every principle of armored warfare the Germans understood, this was the moment to press the advantage. What happened instead was a radio call they could not hear, followed by consequences they could not stop. 2 Shermans appeared over the same ridge where one had died. Then 3. Then 5. A veteran German panzer commander, captured in late 1944 and interviewed at length by Allied intelligence officers, described destroying 6 American tanks in a single afternoon of concentrated fighting. By evening, his own attack had collapsed, not through any tactical failure, not through any maneuver, but because the Americans had simply fed more tanks into the battle faster than he could destroy them. His crew had fired until the barrel was too hot to aim. The Americans still had more. He sat across from his interrogators and said, with the careful precision of a professional soldier reporting a technical finding rather than a defeat, "We were not fighting a tank regiment. We were fighting something I do not have a word for." German maintenance crews were legendary. They could cannibalize 3 wrecked vehicles under a camouflage net by moonlight and have a functioning panzer ready by dawn. Every tank was a precious national asset. American ordnance crews operated by a completely different logic. They towed a damaged Sherman to the rear if convenient. If not, they left it where it sat. Mechanical failures that would demand a German crew to stop and repair under fire were simply abandoned. A replacement already en route from a depot, restocked from a train, loaded from a ship, launched from a yard already building the next one. German officers who first observed this reported it as criminal wastefulness. Then the reevaluation came, slowly at first, then with the sudden, vertiginous quality of a foundation giving way. It was not wastefulness. It was confidence expressed as doctrine. The American Army treated replacement as more efficient than repair, because its industrial base made replacement genuinely faster. Somewhere behind every American soldier, a civilization was running at full productive capacity, around the clock, generating weapons and medicine and food at a rate that made German conservation not a virtue, but an anachronism. Perhaps the most psychologically disorienting encounters came not during combat, but in its aftermath, when German soldiers overran American positions. By late 1944, the average German infantryman existed at the absolute margin of endurance. He was perpetually hungry. His uniform was worn and patched. He counted every rifle cartridge because he had been told, not as a figure of speech, but as a logistical fact, that ammunition was precious and would not easily be replaced. Then, during a counterattack in the Ardennes or a breakthrough in the Hurtgen forest, his squad would storm an American foxhole and step into a different world. The crates of K rations, each individual kit containing not just calories, but a pack of cigarettes, chewing gum, a square of chocolate. Ammunition stockpiles that made German supply officers physically uncomfortable to look at. In one captured American dugout, a German officer discovered a portable shower unit. In another, a mimeograph machine, still warm, used to print a daily company newsletter for ordinary enlisted men. Not a high command bulletin, a company newsletter, containing articles about sports scores and letters from home. The machine became one of the more quietly devastating artifacts of the encounter. The American system, even in a foxhole in a Belgian winter, was built on the assumption that the soldier's psychological state, his sense of connection to home and normalcy, was a logistical priority worth sustaining. The ordinary infantryman's inner life was, in the American calculation, a military asset. The supply lines that fed this abundance were themselves a revelation that German intelligence officers refused to believe. The Red Ball Express, the trucking operation supplying the Allied advance across France, ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, delivering an average of 12,500 tons of supplies to the front line every single day. When these figures first appeared in German intelligence summaries, a senior logistics officer on Rundstedt's staff reportedly read the document twice, set it down, and told the officer who had handed it to him, "This is either the most sophisticated deception operation in the history of warfare, or we have already lost." He was not wrong. In the prisoner of war camps, with combat replaced by enforced reflection, German officers finally had time to observe their captors carefully. What they saw confounded them in ways that battlefield chaos had not allowed them to fully process. The American guards slouched. They addressed sergeants by nicknames and chewed gum during formal exchanges. By every measure of the Prussian standard, they were undisciplined and unsoldierly. And yet, the slouching private's combat boots were newer and more waterproof than the ones the German major had been issued as a senior staff officer. The American enlisted men received 3 hot meals a day, reliably, in conditions where German soldiers had been on cold rations for months. A wounded American soldier on the forward line had a statistically better chance of surviving his wounds than a German soldier wounded in a rear area hospital, because of penicillin, because of blood plasma, because of a medical evacuation system that treated individual survival not as a luxury but as a tactical necessity. The German officer's contempt did not disappear cleanly. It curdled into something far more unsettling, an anxiety born not of fear of the enemy's tactical strength, but of a growing understanding of the enemy's underlying philosophy. The Wehrmacht had been designed at its core to create the ideal soldier, a man trained to exceptional standards, forged into a precise instrument of national will. The stormtrooper, the elite professional whose personal qualities of courage and will were themselves weapons. The American system appeared to be built on no such philosophy. It was informal, egalitarian, indifferent to the outward forms of military bearing. But the German officers in those camps, with time stretching out in front of them, began to understand that appearances concealed a logic as rigorous as anything the Prussian tradition had ever produced, only aimed at entirely different ends. The American system was not trying to create the perfect warrior. It was trying to sustain the ordinary man, built with cold industrial clarity around the assumption that the ordinary human being, properly fed and equipped, properly supported when wounded, backed by overwhelming coordinated fire, would fight effectively enough to win. The goal was not to forge the individual beyond his human nature. The goal was to ensure that his human nature was never the limiting factor. The Wehrmacht sought to create soldiers who could transcend their limitations. The American system accepted human limitations and built a machine designed to compensate for every single one of them. In the long war of attrition that 1944 had become, only one of those philosophies could sustain itself. The Battle of the Bulge was, in the German military imagination, the last serious attempt to prove the old logic still held. Hitler's Ardennes offensive of December 1944 was conceived as a demonstration that concentrated armor moving fast through unexpected terrain, under the protective cover of winter weather, could still shatter an opponent who was materially superior but operationally complacent. The initial execution was genuinely stunning. German armor punched through American positions at points where they were thin and unprepared. The fog grounded Allied air forces. For a few desperate, almost intoxicating days, it seemed as though the clock had been reversed 4 years. But beneath the tactical success, the structural mathematics of the encounter were already working against Germany, with a patience no individual heroism could alter. The offensive required fuel, in quantities German logistics, stretched to functional collapse, could not guarantee. The plan had factored in captured American fuel depots as an essential element, not a contingency. German commanders who reached them recorded the sight with the same stunned disorientation that appeared in every German account of encountering American supply at scale. Enormous, organized, and incomprehensible in volume. They had found what they needed. It was right in front of them, and they could not reach it. At Bastogne, the surrounded 101st Airborne Division refused to break. Cut off, outgunned, fighting in cold so brutal that the wounded had to be kept moving to survive, they held. The German command sent a formal written surrender demand. The American commander's response was a single word: nuts. Transport aircraft flew supply missions through weather that had grounded every other aviation operation on both sides, dropping ammunition, medicine, and food into the perimeter. The defenders were not merely kept alive. They were kept aggressive, conducting offensive operations within the encirclement, preventing the ring from tightening. Then the weather broke. The Jabos returned. Not in flights of 4 or 8, in hundreds. German armor that had advanced under winter cloud was now exposed on open roads, its fuel running critically low, its supply lines severed by air interdiction that had no precedent in the German experience of the war. The elite panzer divisions of the SS, the most feared armored formations in the German order of battle, found themselves unable to maneuver, unable to advance, unable to withdraw at any useful speed. Their fuel ran out miles from the objective. German tank crews climbed out of their vehicles on frozen Belgian roads and walked east. They left their tanks, the most sophisticated armored vehicles Germany had produced, sitting empty on the roadside. The offensive did not end in defeat in the conventional sense. It simply stopped, starved of the one resource its planners had assumed they could seize. In the spring of 1945, as the last prisoner of war camps filled with men who had once been the soldiers of the most formidable military institution in European history, the process of understanding was complete. The German officers who had dismissed American soldiers as undisciplined civilians playing at war now understood, with the full weight of professional reckoning, what they had actually been facing. Not an army in the traditional sense, not a force built on martial tradition or the warrior ethos or the theology of national will. What they had faced was something their entire professional framework had no category for. It was a modern industrial democracy that had made the collective decision to win a war, and had applied to that decision the full productive capacity of the most economically powerful society that had ever existed. The factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh and Cleveland had run continuously, around the clock. The shipyards launched vessels faster than they could be sunk. The laboratories produced medicine that kept individual soldiers alive at rates the German medical system could not match. The food distribution system fed an army in the field, in winter, in combat, better than Germany fed its garrison troops in well-supplied rear areas. The German soldier had been trained to defeat an army. He had encountered a country. His tactical skill remained genuine and documented to the last day. German soldiers with inferior equipment and dwindling supplies still demonstrated, in the delaying actions of 1944 and the defensive battles of early 1945, the improvised competence their training had always produced. They did not stop being skilled soldiers. Their tradition did not stop being formidable in its own terms. But formidable in its own terms was no longer sufficient. The terms had changed. The German major in that canvas tent had been asking the wrong question. He had been evaluating discipline, bearing, tactical aggression. The visible markers of military professionalism his training told him were the true measures of fighting power. He should have been asking what stood behind that soldier. What invisible architecture of production and logistics and medicine and organization had trained him, fed him, equipped him, healed him when wounded, and stood ready to replace him the moment he fell? What invisible continent had made that soldier possible, and what that continent would do the following morning, for as many years as the war required? The answer was not a general. It was not a doctrine or a warrior ethos or a philosophy of war. The German military mind, the inheritor of Clausewitz and Moltke, had finally met its match. But it was not a rival genius. It was not a superior doctrine. It was not even a braver or more determined enemy. It was an assembly line, and the assembly line won.